What's up, Scyushi Squad? We back in more Trove, and today we're gonna be doing the. It's a little bit late. It was my birthday yesterday, so I kind of took the day off ish. Anyways, today we're gonna be doing a Boomeranger tutorial. So this is gonna be talking about how you're going to end up building the Boomeranger. We're not necessarily going to end up going into any of the gameplay functionality of the character so much, because we've already got that as our preview with the 35k series, where I ended up actually just recently doing a video showing off the Boomeranger in both U10 as well as Geode Surface, Geode Caves, Delves. Yeah, anyways, the point is that as of right now, frankly speaking, the Boomeranger is pretty good. It's a pretty good contender for most classes in the game. Like, it's actually pretty decent for farming and stuff. The problem is that, just going into it, the Boomeranger is not the best speed farmer because it doesn't really have any abilities for speed farming per se, and then in terms of delves, it does a surprising amount of damage, but generally speaking is going to end up being outshined by other classes. As of right now, with the Shadowhunter rework, it ended up reworking a lot of the other classes, so those of you on console won't have this particular build of the Boomeranger yet. But rest assured that you can main the Boomeranger after this update. He's still not going to end up being as good as he should be. Frankly speaking, I'd like to see his damage increased a little bit more, but beggars can't be choosers, man. The Boomeranger's always been more of a fun character than functional in my eyes. But now it's nice that we're kind of at the point where the class is actually a little bit more functional. So anyways, obviously there's two different ways you can end up using the character, which is going to end up being either melee or bow. Bow, generally speaking, is going to end up having much more damage and a little bit more control for, you know, obviously you're ranged, so you could shoot a dungeon boss from further away. However, the shots don't actually phase through enemies, so if you want to end up fighting groups of enemies, which is most situations, granted, you'll probably end up using the sword, just because when you go into U10 dungeons and stuff like that, a lot of enemies can bottleneck corridors and get in the way of you shooting the boss. But if you have the sword, that's, you know, then that is no longer going to end up being a problem. So let's get into, you know, we're going to talk about the gear, we're going to talk about the ally, and so on and so forth. So as far as the gear is concerned, generally speaking, you're going to want to have movement speed, attack speed on your gear. Ignore the max health that I have on this. It's just because I didn't bother re-rolling it yet. But that's going to end up being kind of the main point of the character. However, if you want to have more damage on the Boomeranger, you would sacrifice your movement speed, which generally sucks for speed farming and just playability. You want to have a lot of movement speed, but attack speed ends up overall increasing your damage. So having attack speed is a priority if you're going to sacrifice movement speed or attack speed for crit damage. So you kind of just have that across the board with all of your gear. The ring itself, there is a couple different ring effects that you can end up having, but generally speaking, you're going to be looking for blast bow. That's going to end up being the best hidden effect that you can get off of a crystal gem for the Boomeranger right now, because it's going to end up adding an explosion effect to the Boomeranger's bow shots specifically. Not to say the other hidden effects aren't okay, but generally speaking, they're not going to be nearly as good as the blast bow effect, okay? For an ally, I would recommend probably using Animated Jug, just because it's going to end up giving you the physical damage, it gives you the health when you fight enemies, but it also gives you the movement speed buff as well. So obviously it's going to end up being really good for that. For the banner, generally speaking, you're just going for one that has the most light value. If you can end up getting a permanent torch, obviously that's going to be the best one, but I still haven't got my permanent torch up to this date, so yeah. Oh boy. For Flask, I always recommend Death Defying, just because generally speaking, the way that you build your characters in this game is you're going to have as much damage as possible, which means that, you know, you're going to end up having as little health as possible, just because all of your stats are going to be focused on the damage aspect. And because of it, you can end up being really, really squishy, on top of the fact that endgame enemies will usually just one-shot you over and over again. Not to say that you can't, you know, not use Death Defying, but generally speaking, you're going to have a much better time if you're using Death Defying. However, there's just kind of the same staples of you could use Conjurer's Crucible, or, you know, Vial of, well, not Vial of Unleash, but Conjurer's Crucible is all right, just because it'll end up giving you your flash back if you can trigger Magic Find often enough. But again, generally speaking, the rule of thumb is just Death Defying. It's easier than bothering with any of the others. For the emblems, you've got a couple different options. Obviously, Sure Strike is going to be something that you're going to be using early on, just because it's going to end up giving you that extra 20% to crit hit until you can end up having 100% or close to 100% for your crit hit. You can end up using one of the ally like minions that end up getting summoned, obviously the one that's based off of physical damage instead, but generally speaking, you would be using Sure Strike, Martial Emblem, and then eventually you could swap Sure Strike out when your stats get high enough to use Unyielding, Trailblazing, Chromatic. Well, no, Chromatic doesn't matter as much, but you know, kind of pick your poison, right? Generally speaking, it's pretty much always going to end up being the same old, same old. Maybe when you're farming U10, if you're strong enough, you can end up swapping Martial out for another emblem of your choice, just because of the fact that you're dealing enough damage that it doesn't really matter as much. For the subclass ability, I always just use a Knight. That's just kind of my standard, because I like the movement speed on the mount, and unfortunately, like I said, the Boomeranger doesn't really have great movement speed. He's going to end up having a pretty decent base movement speed, you can see. I mean, granted, I have full Crystal 4, and they all have movement speed on them, so your stats would end up being a little bit lower if you had lesser gear. But the fact of the matter remains that Knight subclass ability gives you more flash, and it gives you more mount movement speed. But if you're going for damage and functionality, then you would possibly end up using I guess probably just Lunacy. Generally speaking, that's kind of the big go-to to end up outputting more damage, because you'll end up triggering Lunacy mode and then just destroying things. Or you could end up just messing around with other abilities strictly for the stats themselves, but generally speaking, the subclass is not as important as you would think. It does make a difference, but it's not as important as you would think. Now, before we get into the gems themselves, let's talk about the stats that you're going to be focusing on. So generally speaking, you want to end up having as close as possible to 100% crit hit, and then your physical base damage is anywhere from 100,000 and up to maybe 150k, and then your crit damage you want to have anywhere from 800 and up to, you see I'm very, very close to actually 2,000 crit damage. Now, there is a point where the damage fall off just doesn't really work out as much, so there's kind of a fine line between having a certain amount of physical damage and then having a balance of that with your crit damage. But generally speaking, it doesn't make as much of a difference as you would think. Just generally, like, I've tried it out on all sorts of different characters and stuff, and the damage numbers is not really as big of a deal as some people end up making it. I'm not saying everybody makes a big deal out of it, but some people do. But anyways, aside from that, though, you're on the Boomeranger, so frankly speaking, it doesn't matter that much, because it's not like you're going to end up outputting insane amounts of damage, right? Like, pretty much as soon as I'm finished with this tutorial, I'm going to swap all my gems back to Shadowhunter, just because I want to keep playing on that class. But anyways, let's look at the gems themselves, so I can kind of show you what you're going to be going for. So Vampiric, actually, I shouldn't be using Vampiric for my Cosmic Gem, but it's kind of just what I have. It does give you the movement speed. It gives you lifesteal, which is surprisingly really, really good on the Boomeranger. I was very surprised when I ended up doing in my 35k video how much survivability the Boomeranger had when I was in the Delves, strictly because of the Vampiric. Either way, you can either use this or just swap it out for the Berserk Cosmic Gem, because Berserk obviously is going to end up giving you more light value as you damage enemies, which ultimately increases your damage output. Generally speaking, for your Cosmic Gems, you want to have all pearls in light, as like just 100%. All of your pearls have to be into the light stat on every single one of them, and then otherwise all of the other stats is going to end up being physical damage and crit damage. Now, for your other empowered gems, obviously you want to end up having the class gem ability, which gives you Bach Bomb, which scales a lot better now, which, you throw down a bomb, it explodes into a bunch of chickens, and they end up doing insane amounts of damage. Explosive Epilogue, if you're maining the bow, is really, really good. But otherwise, other options is going to be Pyro Disc. Obviously, it's just a must because of the movement speed. And then if you don't have Explosive Epilogue, you can kind of just use whatever, really, because the other gems aren't really that great. Maybe Cubic Curtain, just because you would end up having a little bit more survivability because it gives you, the shield that ends up defending you. Now, as far as the empowered gems are concerned, generally the rule of thumb that I always do is 2 pearls physical, 1 pearl crit damage, and then the last stat is going to end up being crit hit. You can see, though, that my stats aren't super duper ideal in the fact that I don't have like 100% crit hit. That's because the gems that I have currently are actually built for my Shadow Hunter, where he ends up having 100% crit hit. But anyways, what I do for the lesser gems then is you can kind of do a mix and mash. Like some of them can end up having 3 pearls in physical or 3 pearls in crit damage, whatever. Most of all, you're just trying to end up finding a decent balance between the two, so you don't want to be leaning too much in either direction. But again, a general rule of thumb is you will go 3 by 3. So what I like to do, this is just an easy way of explaining this. It's not like the ideal perfect stats or anything. You don't have to follow it to the letter. But generally speaking, you're going to have 3 of your lesser gems have 2 pearls crit damage, 1 pearl physical, last stat crit hit. And then you're going to end up having the other 3 lesser gems be 2 pearl physical damage, 1 pearl crit damage, and then the last stat as crit hit. Any extra crit hit that you have over 100%, you can just swap out for max health, which generally speaking, I'm very surprised at the fact that Boomer just has such absurd amounts of health for me. Like I'm not exactly 100% sure why, but I guess he just scales a little bit better with his max health. But that's kind of what you can end up doing for the lesser gems. Again, you don't have to follow it 100% to the letter. It's just kind of a ease of mind solution. So it's like you just know, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for, this is the goal. But if you're slightly off from that, it's not gonna make much of a difference. And generally speaking, that's going to end up doing it for the Boomer. As far as I know, I think that pretty much covers everything. So hopefully I didn't mess up on any of the info. But yeah, Boomeranger as of right now is a really fun, cool character. Generally speaking, though, I still would like to see its damage increased just a little bit, because it's not really at a high enough damage value that it's keeping up with the other characters. The 2 most substantial updated characters with the Shadowhunter rework would actually be Boomeranger and Candy Barb, and I would say that Candy Barb scaled a lot better than the Boomeranger ended up doing. But you know, pretty soon I'm going to end up probably doing the Candy Barb a little bit more in the future, talking about, you know, the 35k video and the build with him and stuff like that. But generally speaking, today we're going to be, you know, focusing on the Boomer. I'm going to swap my gems over to another class after I'm done with this video. And then otherwise, if you guys and gals want to check out the stream that I'm going to be doing after this video is done uploading, where we're going to be doing the Cubesley event, and I'll end up having a Cubesley tutorial come out tomorrow. But for those of you that are watching this tutorial long into the future, I appreciate you guys watching, and I would even more so appreciate if you smash like, sub for more, buy the merch you want, support the channel, and have yourselves a wonderful day, ladies and gentlemen.